Please welcome Aaron Campbell.
Thank you. So I'm Aaron Campbell, and I lead the security team for the WordPress open source project. I've been doing that for a little over a year and a half, but I've been a part of the team basically since we started it. And we've learned a lot of lessons along the way. Most of them that I'm going over today are not specific coding technical things. It's a lot more of how our team functions well and how we are able to run security for that large of a project. I am employed by GoDaddy to work full-time on WordPress. I started doing that about 2 years ago, basically with the directive to try to help make WordPress better. WordPress is all volunteer powered, but there are some aspects of a project when it reaches that size that need really consistent attention. So companies like GoDaddy that hire people to do that really help us keep things moving along. I've been leading the team for a year and a half, been on it since we started it, I guess about 8 years ago. I've been contributing to WordPress for about 12 years, but the story of how I got here starts even a little bit earlier than that. Who remembers this game? We got like one person, a couple people. This is Gorillas. It was distributed in 1991 with MS-DOS 5. I was only 9 years old, but I loved this game. I played it constantly, which when you look at it, it's kind of strange because the graphics are terrible and the gameplay was equally terrible. And this was the same time that the Super Nintendo came out, and I had one of those, and it sort of put this to shame. But the thing that kept bringing me back to this game over and over was this. Gorillas was not distributed to showcase what PCs were capable of around graphics and gameplay. It was distributed to showcase QBasic, Microsoft's integrated development environment for the basic programming language, so it was distributed as source code. It was open source. It may not be the kind of open source that I've sort of grown to love and advocate for now, because that first line right up there is a copyright, but it really, I credit it with shifting sort of my focus from loving electronics and computers and just enjoying them to really being interested in how they work, how I can control them, and how I can make them do what I wanted them to do. And this, along with a couple other open source things that 9-year-old me was able to get his hands on, are how I started to learn to write code. From that point of learning to write code, it was about a year, maybe as long as 2, before I started into black hat hacking. Breaking into systems back then was drastically easier than it is now. Security was not really where it ought to have been in the early 90s. And it was partially because we were right at the beginning of kind of this shift where companies were even caring at all about security. We were having yes. We were having this changeover from sort of, if you had the disks, you had the program, to things like activation keys. That's sort of where I settled in, but those activation keys, the algorithms behind them, were pretty terrible. And it's because everybody was focused not on the technical aspects of their security, they were focused on the secrecy of their security. And that is something that I think has been tough for our industry through those years, at least from where I sit, where lots of people have focused not on actual security, but on secrecy as security. If they don't know how we're securing a thing, then they can't exploit it. And this is something that I try to push real hard against, where I try to open up what we're doing as a project, the struggles that we've hit, the lessons that we've learned, the tools that we use. I love to get the chance to sort of share that with everybody. When we started our team about 8 years ago, our goal seemed really awesome. It's just keep WordPress secure, right? Obvious. Except almost immediately we realized this didn't line up with our overall project goals, which sounds strange maybe, but the truth is from the very beginning of WordPress, its focus, its goal has been to democratize publishing, to give everyone a voice. Not to make the greatest piece of software, not to have the most amazing code, but to give people that tool so that they have a voice. It was our users that needed to be the most important thing, and so we had to shift from trying to secure our product, which was already pretty big and already relatively old, and so there were some challenges there, but we had to shift our focus to keeping WordPress users secure instead. And it's important to understand sort of this mindset shift because it really affects all the things that we as a project, including the security team, do. And you won't really be able to understand why we're doing some of the things we do unless you realize that securing the WordPress code is only one small piece of our overall goal. And this was really the first lesson, I guess, that we learned, if you will, users over software. Our users are more important than our software itself. This makes some things a little bit more challenging. For example, a lot of us that distribute products probably deal with this. Users that are using an older version are less secure. When your focus is on securing your software, the solution to this is you put out a secure version of your software. That was your job. You fixed the problem. Their job is to use that, right? That's their problem, the user's problem. But for us, putting out a secure version was only the first step. It didn't actually accomplish our goal until it was being used by the users. And so we had this gap that we had to try to solve. How do we actually get it all the way there in order to accomplish our goal of keeping users secure? Well, for us, that was going the extra step and upgrading for them, which is how we ended up with automatic updates. Automatic updates went into WordPress 3.7, which is like 4.5 years ago. So we've been operating under this mindset for quite a while. And building automatic updates was hard, and doing them securely and not breaking sites, especially with all the different ways that WordPress is used, it was a huge challenge, but it was the only way that we could see to actually accomplish our goal of securing our users instead of just our piece of software. It made a couple small things easier on us when we focused on users, when we had that clarity. We used to struggle a lot with figuring out when we should backport security fixes. There was constant discussion about how many people were affected and how big of a deal it really was and how hard it was going to be to backport it to previous releases. And there was a lot of discussion and often a lot of differing opinions. But now our sort of decision-making flowchart for this is super simple. Does it help keep our users secure? Yes, backport it. And this is tough for us as a security team, but it's a thing that we have embraced and continue to do. All security vulnerabilities that are fixed in WordPress are backported all the way back to either whenever they started or version 3.7 when auto updates were introduced. The current version is 4.9, so when we release a fix, we are releasing 13 new versions simultaneously, as well as patching the code that's going to be the next version. It increased our workload, but it helped us accomplish our goal. We also realized, though, that even though this one little thing, this one decision was maybe easier to make, all in all, securing users was crazy complex. We had this code base that was under our control when our goal was just securing WordPress, but when we had to secure users, they all use plugins and themes. That code is not under our control, but does affect the security of our users, so we have to care about it. Users host thousands of different hosts in at least as many different configurations, and those are not under our control, but it affects the security of our users, so we have to care about it. The other big thing that affects the security of our users is our users themselves, who are not very good at keeping themselves secure. As we look across the sort of, I guess, we get a pretty good picture of WordPress sites that are compromised. By and large, the biggest issue is still poor user practices, usually around something as simple as passwords. Users are terrible at that, so we realized if we want to protect our users, we have to secure our software. We have to figure out how to secure other people's code, we have to figure out how to secure their hosting, and we have to educate them. And all of those are problems that we have been struggling with and trying to tackle. I'm going to talk some about the solutions that we came up with in just a little bit, but from the very beginning when we thought, yeah, we need to educate users, we got to teach them. We know what they need to be doing. We just got to tell them. Little bonus lesson here, educating users is terribly hard. They do not listen well. And for us, we have tens of millions of users all over the world, and they don't have to necessarily give us any kind of contact info in order to download and use our software, so we don't have direct lines of communication with them. But it was important enough that it's an issue that we've struggled through and eventually found some solutions to that I will talk about again in just a little bit. To understand the next couple things, you need a short, quick, history lesson of WordPress. We're old. 15 years old is very old for software projects. Any software that's been around for 15 years and is still actively used and developed has changed dramatically. And I think that a lot of our change has been driven heavily by our growth. I don't have numbers going all the way back to the beginning. I don't think people cared to track numbers as much back then. But in 2011, W3 Tech started tracking estimated CMS usage, percentage of the internet. And the numbers are rough because tracking that kind of stuff is hard. But in 2011, they estimated we powered about 13% of the internet. And the end of last month, they estimated we powered about 31.4% of the internet. And that's a lot of growth. And it looks very linear, but I will tell you it did not feel that way when we were in it as, working on the project. But that's because these are percentages of the internet, and the internet's grown dramatically as well. And if there's anything harder than tracking percentages of CMS usage, it's probably counting the size of the internet. But I took some likely terribly inaccurate numbers and plugged them in anyway because I think that it gives you a better picture. Maybe the numbers are wrong, but the shape of the graph, I think, better shows what it felt like to go through this growth period. And the years are labeled, and that's pretty obvious, but there's a few points where WordPress had to grow up a lot. And I labeled a few of them. In mid-2013 was when we finally got an actual build process for WordPress. It was a little behind the times when we finally rolled that out, but it was really hard to do. At that time, W3 Techs estimated we were powering 19% of the internet, and we had built a lot of tooling around our repository as it sat, and that all needed to be redone because our repository needed to be reorganized. It was a really difficult task because it was past due. Like, it was way past when it was needed. In late 2014, we finally moved to a reasonable form of communication. We use Slack now. All the way up until then, our main form of communication was a channel on IRC, on Freenode IRC. That is how we ran WordPress when we were powering roughly 22% of the internet. And then last year is when I think our security team really made one of those big growth spurts. And that was when we launched our bug bounty program on HackerOne. And as part of that process, we redid a lot of our processes, procedures, tooling, etc. But again, it was really late in coming. We were supposedly powering 28% of the internet, and we were running all of our security reporting for a project the size of WordPress through a security @ email address that distributed to a handful of mailboxes of people who were supposed to handle that. And the biggest thing that I realized through each of these really difficult growth periods is that we really should have been assessing our needs far more often. It's real easy to sort of get set up on what it is that you need. For us, 8 years ago when we launched the security team, that security @ email address and our couple tools that we used was great. It was just what we needed. But 2 years later, we probably needed something else, but we never really took the time to sit down and reassess our needs until we sort of hit a wall and it was impossible to do what we were supposed to be doing with the way things were currently set up. And that is way too late to be reassessing. Growing iteratively, looking at where you're at every 6 months or a year, if you haven't done that, if you haven't sat down and said, hey, are our processes, are our tools right for us? They were, but are they still? Do so, because these huge growth spurts, they're not healthy, and they're really difficult to get through. I think it was maybe even a little bit more difficult for us in some ways because we're an all-volunteer security team. That in general is very hard to do on any project, and one the size of WordPress especially. And about a year and a half ago, as we were sort of restructuring and struggling through a lot of that, I really was asking myself, is it even possible to run security for a project like WordPress with an all-volunteer team? Because volunteers are hard. Now, there's some benefits to volunteers, I think, and I think it's important to point that out. People volunteer to do a thing because they think it's really important, or because they enjoy it. And either of those things brings with it some level of passion, and that passion can drive performance. And that's awesome. I think it also brings us a diversity of input that we couldn't otherwise get. Our team is a little over 30 people, and some of them work for hosts, and some of them work for security companies, and some of them, quite a few of them, work for various development agencies. Some of those agencies focus on enterprise. Some are focused on app development with WordPress as a backend. All these different ways that WordPress is being used, and our team is actually doing that. So we have all that variety of input, and I think that's really healthy. But there's some massive downsides to a volunteer team, and the biggest one is that available hours fluctuate dramatically, right? People give you, they're dedicating a few hours or a handful of hours to volunteer, but when they have a big project at work, or they're coming up on a deadline, or they have some big life event going on, they just don't have hours to volunteer. It's not that they don't want to, they simply don't have it available. And the number of times that seems to happen to a large percentage of the team all at once is a little bit mind-boggling. So we had to sit down and try to figure out, how do we make this work? Because all of WordPress is volunteer-powered. Like, this has felt really normal all along, but the security team needs some consistency. We really do. In the past, the solution had always been grow the team. If we needed the number of hours that we were getting from 5 people, but those people were busy. You could grow the team to 10 people, and now as long as only 5 people were busy, the other 5 could handle it. And that had been our solution to this all along in the past. So that was my first go-to when we started running into this a year and a half ago, but it didn't really work this time. I think that we had hit a scale where simply growing the team was just no longer the solution. The team got so big that it wasn't that people didn't have hours to volunteer, it's just that they weren't. And it was mostly because everyone said, there's so many of us, somebody else is going to get it, right? Somebody else is going to take care of it. And it completely backfired, did not work at all. So we shrunk the team back down, and the thing that we did successfully land on is that we now operate a little bit as a hybrid team. We're still mostly volunteer. The vast majority of hours are volunteer hours. But for example, I'm paid by GoDaddy to work on WordPress, and a lot of those hours are sank into WordPress security. Similarly, there's a handful of people on our team that are given a certain number of hours by their company paid. Usually it's like a 20% project, so they get like 8 hours a week. And a couple people put that all into security, and a couple people sort of split that back and forth between core development and security, depending on where they're needed. And this has given us the ability to sort of reap the benefits of a volunteer team, but also never completely have no hours available because we need that consistency. Our tools are completely focused on making us more efficient, making it so that we can do more in less hours, because hours are our most precious resource with a volunteer team. We've tried lots of really new, great, fantastic tools, and what we've settled in on is actually a really simplistic set of tools. We use Slack as our main form of communication. I mentioned that. We have a private channel for security. We've also got some scripts set up that let anyone on the team easily spin up a security subchannel that automatically invites the whole security team and allows us to ad hoc invite certain people that may be helpful in discussing a specific issue, but don't necessarily need to see everything that's going on. We have a couple of those channels that are actually permanently spun up that I'll get to in a little bit that have very specific purposes. We use Track. Some people love it, some people hate it, mostly the latter, but the WordPress project has used Track since the very beginning, and because most of us have been around it for a while, we're really comfortable with it. And so while we've tried a lot of much better bug trackers, this one seems to work the best for us, and so we have come back to it. It's a completely internal-facing tool, so it's only something that our team needs to use anyway, and we use this mostly for putting up patches on things, doing code review on those, iterating on them, et cetera, et cetera. And then we use HackerOne, yes, to power our bug bounty program, but also as our main sort of way of communicating with reporters and researchers and keeping them in the loop. And in this big changeover where we sort of updated our tool set and settled in on this and tried a lot of other things, the biggest thing that really stood out to me as we tested and got rid of a whole bunch of tools is that tools don't fix most of our problems. They often help highlight where some of those problems really are. We think that they're because of our tools, but for us, most of them weren't. For example, we really struggled when we used a security @ email address to keep hackers in the loop. As they reported a thing to us and we focused in on working on it, we often went radio silent, didn't really keep them updated, and they mistook that radio silence as nothing happening, which is kind of understandable. And it strained relationships. We had a tough time keeping people updated. And now we thought, as we sort of piloted the HackerOne tool and we saw how amazing that was for keeping people in the loop, how easy it was. No longer were we staring at an email going, somebody else is probably going to reply to this, and then finally saying, okay, fine, no one's replying to it, I'll reply to it. And then 6 replies all came through at once. There are all these downsides to this old tool, so we thought this new tool, it's gonna fix the issue for us. And then we went through our whole test, we launched on HackerOne, and we're still terrible at keeping researchers in the loop. And it's because the tool wasn't the problem, and so the tool didn't fix it. The way we fixed that particular problem is adjusting things around so that we no longer assign issues to a single person. We have these small, like 3 to 4 person teams that issues get assigned to, so that there's a handful of people that can see that someone needs an update. But also in just kind of bringing in some new people to our team who are focused on keeping communication flowing well, right? We had people who were good at fixing issues. We had people that had historical knowledge of our code base, all this sort of classic stuff that you expect a security team to have, but we needed those communication people that wouldn't get distracted by fixing the issue and would be focused in on this thing that we were not doing well. So making those adjustments fixed the actual problem when we thought tools were going to fix it. Which brings me to one of the sort of biggest lessons that we've learned over the last 1.5 to 2 years. We have struggled for quite a few years with how do we take our security all the way to the users with these 3 big areas that seemed like problems that were almost impossible to solve, right? Code that wasn't under our control. How are we gonna keep users safe when they're using code that's not under our control? Hosting environments that are also not under our control, and educating our users that we tried so many different ways and none of them really seemed effective. And the crazy thing is, these 3 biggest problems that we had been struggling with as a team for 4 or 5 years now at least, were actually all solved with the same basic thing, which was building relationships. I think that we often, at least the WordPress team definitely did, we often overlook the fact that there are other people that can help us accomplish our goals, no matter what those goals are. And so we took the time to sit down. We said, okay, we're having these struggles. If we controlled everything, if we controlled absolutely everything, what would we do? Well, we would make plugin code more secure. So we need to start building relationships with the people that do control that. One of our permanent sub-channels in our Slack is for communicating with plugin authors. Right now, it's just our security team and the authors of some of the biggest plugins in the WordPress space, the ones that are on maybe 1 million or a few million sites. But we've been working real heavily with them to try to make sure that their security works well with ours, that we're functioning well together, and that we're setting a good example at the top, because in our ecosystem, everybody that's building all these other plugins, tens of thousands of plugins, are kind of looking to the top for either examples or to straight up copy code and use. We've built a lot of relationships with hosts, WAFs, CDNs, trying to see where we can protect our users in ways that we were never able to before, right? WordPress could only, when we were just securing our own code, we could only protect users at that application layer once they got all the way down to WordPress. And by building these relationships, we've now been able to, when we see a problem that could be fixed at the network layer or mitigated at the network layer, we can get all the major hosts and companies like Cloudflare and such to start protecting millions of WordPress sites before we even push out any fix. And for educating users, all of these same companies that we're building these relationships with have much more direct hands-on relationships with our users. So we've been able to work with them to help build some education programs and help them to educate our users. Building better programs through hosts, building even some things through search engines like Google and their search engine console, being able to work better with them, to use them as a channel to educate our users. I wanted to leave a lot of time for Q&A because when I throw out talks like this, it's always interesting to see what kinds of things people are interested to know. And we're really open as a project and would love to share whatever it is that you're interested in that you'd like to know. Oh, and there's a mic to run around. I almost forgot because we are live streaming.
Hey, I have a very small CMS that's not open source, but I'm thinking about open source. But I'm kind of terrified because then everyone would know where the holes are. And, I think I'm smart, but I know that I haven't caught all the holes. Is there a recommended path or some RTFM you have for folks who are thinking about going down this route?
So that's really interesting. We get that sort of mentality a lot. People say, well, it can't be secure because it's open source and everybody can look into it and find the security vulnerabilities. And obviously there's some danger that someone's going to see a thing that you didn't see. They're going to find that vulnerability and they're going to exploit it. It's possible. I mean, you're giving them a peek into your code. But similarly, they may find that vulnerability and want to exploit it, but somebody else may find that vulnerability and let you know about it. I think that if you're going to go the route of open sourcing a thing, it can actually be really beneficial. So many eyes on a thing help find all these issues that you may not have seen, but only if you have good methods for them to then report it to you and ultimately get it fixed. I think that that's the biggest thing. If you're going to open source, I don't think that makes you inherently less secure, but make sure that those channels of communication are in place so that people can help you keep your product secure rather than exploit it in some way that they find. And in general, I think that this has been great in the WordPress project as far as we as a security team, yes, we find issues, but tons of other people have found issues over these 15 years as well that we've been able to fix. And when we fix it because they noticed it, it's fixed for everybody, and that's a big plus. Oh.
Thanks. I actually just wanted to comment about the last gentleman's question there. In the WordPress community, it seems like we went through this phase in 2011, 2012, 2013, where a lot of vulnerabilities came to light. And I think what might have happened is WordPress hit a level of popularity where it became very interesting to security researchers. And so what you might find is at the stage of growth that you're at now, it's not super interesting for people to do kind of pro bono research into vulnerabilities in your platform. But you also don't have a big user base, so there are not going to be a lot of people affected by potential vulnerability. So I would say if you open source it now, as you grow, you're probably going to find that you hit that, hopefully, as you grow, you're going to hit that phase where Now you're really interesting and on everyone's radar, and you go through a bit of a challenging period, and you have to scramble, but then you get past that, and in the WordPress space now, we're in a much better place than we were in 2012, I would say, Aaron.
Yeah, I think that since probably right around 2012 or so, we have felt like we had a giant target on our back, right? Like, because everybody was, if you were trying to compromise websites, WordPress was a great way to do it because there were so many WordPress websites out there. And there is sort of that rough period to get over where you're interesting to people, but you don't necessarily have enough help from other people. Now that WordPress is run in a lot of enterprise sites, Disney and Oprah and some of these big companies that actually do a lot of vulnerability testing and research and stuff and bring it back to us and help us. That's sort of what I feel like got us over that hump. And there are those awkward growth periods that I think are just a little bit more awkward in open source. You kind of got to prepare for those.
It's the first step that I'm most worried about.
Yeah, right.
One site that runs this, here's all the code.
Yep, the very beginning of just putting it out there and somebody seeing it. It can be scary. I've released quite a few open source things, and it can be scary, but ultimately, I've found that if they continue to grow, that it's been ultimately beneficial for the projects that I've done that way.
So there's a lot of time, of course, spent on responding to and fixing security vulnerabilities that either you find or other people find. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the other side of that, of preventing new vulnerabilities from being written, especially when it is a lot of volunteer contributors and kind of maintaining standards of code quality, including security.
Yes. So as a security team, we do a lot of code review, obviously. A lot of people are interested in writing new features and adding new stuff, and that's cool and fun and neat and shiny, but checking to make sure that what's being added is secure, there's a much smaller group of people that considers that fun, and even then, that's only some small percentage of our team, right? But we understand it's important, so we do spend a lot of time doing that kind of code review, especially around big new things that are being added into WordPress. Right now, a complete reworking of the way the editor works in WordPress, a whole new system for that is coming in. It's a ton of code that we've had to continually review and look at. Some of the ways that we're able to sort of keep up is that we've built some tools to keep simple things like code quality and code standards are checked with every commit. While anyone can volunteer to, put in some work and write some code and get some patches up, our committers, the people that can actually put that into the project, they have a little bit better knowledge and are kind of the first line there checking that. But yes, we spend a huge amount of time just making sure that what's already, secure or as secure as we can make it, doesn't slip back into some major problem.
Well, my question actually is going to end up an extension of that one, but assuming you've run into friction when dealing with some feature development teams in terms of them saying, oh no, go away security, we don't want to listen to you. What are some of the strategies that you've adopted to kind of get it to become a win-win and get them on board and get their buy-in? And have you kind of shifted along your journey in terms of we're just going to force this on you whether or not you like it or not, versus a more collaborative approach? So
some of the things that first spring to mind are that we've had some struggles in the past with when these new features want to make use of other libraries that already exist. As a security team, especially as the lead that kind of handles a lot of those relationships with other projects, I feel like we not only have to review that code, but we need to communicate with the authors of those libraries that we're going to use and make sure that they are going to work with us when issues are found, right? All these kinds of things. And that's been a struggle, less that people who want to use these libraries or whatever want us to go away, but more that they just start, they're building, they're doing a thing, they don't even loop us in. You know, we have to really pay close attention and notice it ourselves. So that's been one of the struggles, is just being aware enough of that. Aside from that, probably the biggest actual friction that we have is this constant balance that needs to be found between securing all the things and keeping a product that's easy to use and flexible, right? The thing that I think has helped with that actually is really working with our security team to basically say, look, I know that we all want to secure things as much as possible, but if our goal is to make our users as secure as we can make them, then if we make it fantastic but they don't use it that way, it doesn't actually improve their security. So we have to find this balance point, which is a real mindset change, but we have to find this balance point where we're doing as much security as we can that is bringing those users along with us and sort of maybe iteratively grow that. And so working with our security team to say, okay, sometimes it's not going to be absolutely perfect because we have to work within reality. And then, yes, having to get that buy-in from the teams that are like, no, this is so much easier. Yes, but we have to find, we're going to give a little, but you've got to give a little too. We need to find this balance point in the middle. Yeah.
Yeah, I work on another large open source project, and we're kind of at the stage where we have a product security team and a Slack channel and a build process, but not a bug bounty yet. And there's a lot of discussion as to having a bug bounty. I wanted to hear a bit more how you guys set that up from a point of like scoping, like we're talking about, do plugins get included or not if they're not in core? Mm-hmm. And the security team is really afraid of opening this bug bounty and just being like, everybody's going to be busy for 6 months. Yes. Like, so how do you kind of manage that type of expectation?
So I'll tell you how we manage it now in just a minute, but we didn't manage it enough when we first launched, and that initial, if you're a pretty popular open source project, that initial sort of hit that you get when you first launch that program is pretty intense. We were very overloaded for a period of time. We should have run longer. We ran a sort of a private test that was invite only. We use HackerOne. We found that that's been a fantastic tool for us. But we don't include plugins. We only include all of our products and projects. So we have WordPress as well as BuddyPress, BBPress, and WPCLI, other things that we build, and all of our sites are also under that. So our WordPress.org site, all of our event sites, all that. And some of the things that we should have had more in place is extreme clarity. You probably have some of those issues that are reported relatively regularly and aren't valid. Not just real clearly specifying that on the page, but also have some sort of "are you sure" kind of trigger system that warns people, because it's not, for us, it's not the number of valid issues that are being found that's the struggle, and it's not the monetary expense that's the struggle, it's the noise that's the struggle. It's the number of invalid reports that you sort of have to wade through to get to the valid ones. And I think that that's partially just a volume thing, but also it's not fun to wade through invalid reports. And a volunteer team, who wants to volunteer to do a thing that's not fun, right? So with HackerOne, we helped pilot a program that they put out called Human Augmented Signal, where They have a team that's kind of the first line of defense to filter out the most obviously invalid reports that come through. And that has been absolutely amazing for us. In the last year of our in the first year, only about 9% of reported issues were actually valid. But of the ones that were invalid, more than 50% of those invalid reports were caught by that HackerOne team and never made it to our team, which is pretty great. So looking at things like that might help you through that initial sort of skyrocket in number of issues reported can be really helpful.
So your second lesson was reassess regularly. And what I think is kind of interesting about that is I'm sure your entire team looked at all the stuff that they had on their plate, and it was never important for any given build process, security process, or whatever to be addressed until crisis hit. And I've been at companies that will remain nameless that have let the crisis point come and go, and then still haven't built the changes, and now are facing a real hard problem. So the question I have to you is there anything in hindsight that should have been a warning signal that you were hitting the crisis point before the crisis point became blatantly obvious to everybody? Because everybody on your team was smart, right? And everybody was saying, well, yeah, somebody's complaining that they need better tools, but we've got something more important to work on.
So I think that, I don't know, those things that may tip you off vary dramatically, right? Depending on what kind of crisis you're about to hit, probably. But for us, I think that one of the reasons we missed a lot of those wasn't because the team wasn't smart enough to figure them out or recognize them. It was honestly because we didn't have a good hierarchy within that team. And so there wasn't a person kind of focused on watching for those things. We really didn't have a security team lead. We just had a security team until, I think it was 3 years ago, that we sort of said, hey, we should have somebody in charge. And at that time, it wasn't even in charge so much as it was a person to put their name there that people could go to if they wanted to talk to. Building in some hierarchy where things were flat before, set some expectations that the people at the top are watching for those kinds of oncoming things. That's a thing that I take on myself for the security team. And similarly, in the WordPress project as a whole, we only ever had release leads, someone that was in charge of the next release. And then somebody else would be in charge of the next release. I led WordPress 3.6. That was my thing. I did that, but I didn't also lead 3.7, 3.8, 3.9. Like, I didn't have some long-term plan that everyone was bought into. So getting some of that put back in place, I think, has helped us as well to see those kinds of things coming.
Speaking of crisis, with WordPress being a platform that's created or developed and there's a largely volunteer team, how do you deal with incident response when there's a huge announcement of vulnerabilities? Something that came to mind was like the Panama Papers, that was largely a WordPress, part of that was largely a WordPress plugin vulnerability, and it got a lot of attention. Is there like an incident response protocol that you follow as a team?
That's a thing that we're in the process of still trying to build and figure out. Right now, our team's a little bit just sort of let's jump to it and all hands on deck and let's figure this out. And we're sort of assessing each one as it comes in and figuring it out for that issue, which I don't think is healthy. So we've gone through a lot of these changes and fixed a lot of the other things that we were dealing with, and hopefully that'll be one of the lessons that I've learned by next year, and maybe I can come back and really explain how we changed to figure that out. But right now, we don't have like a response that we follow every time. We're sort of custom building those solutions each time.
Hi, so kind of building a little bit on that question and an earlier one. Multi-party response, wondering if you have any lessons learned or experiences to share about common vulnerabilities that affect multiple companies and how you respond to those.
For us, one of the, I mean, again, a lot of this comes down to relationships, right? There's been this long-standing thing where, for example, every CMS kind of does its own thing. WordPress hasn't really worked with, for example, like even other open source ones, Drupal and Joomla and stuff in our space. We had hardly ever interacted with them on these kinds of levels, even though a lot of security vulnerabilities really do often affect multiple platforms. We now work pretty consistently with the security teams from these other CMSs so that when those things happen, we can do things like coordinated releasing and that kind of stuff. Most of that actually seems to happen on our WordPress Slack. We spin up channels and bring those people in. The security team leads from those other projects are on our Slack already anyway, because we've been trying to communicate regularly. So that's where we tend to handle that. But yeah, that's a thing that I feel like we've gotten better at over the last couple of years. Anyone else? Well, I'll be around for a while. If anybody else has any other questions, come find me and ask. Thank you.